rise, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. I'm back. We're back. I'm your host, Derek Caldwell, with author and speaker Abdu Murray. And it's been a little while since we talked to you, but we've missed you a lot. And we're coming to you with a special episode, doing something a little different than what we normally do. But before we jump into that, Abdu, how have you been doing?
So we've been busy, but we've also been busy planning and preparing for this season of All Rise, and the guests we have, and the theme we've prepared, which was your idea, by the way. I want to make sure we give credit where credit is due. You've you suggested a theme for season 3. So tell people what the theme actually is. I think it's a good one.
Yeah, so the theme that I thought would be a great way to sort of focus a lot of our conversations in this next season of the show is essentially, how did we get here? And that can be taken in a number of different ways. So, for instance, we're going to have an episode people will see pop up with Dr. James Tour. And we're going to be talking about not only how did we get here in a biological, a scientific sense, but how did we get here to the point where people are desperately trying to make the claim that they've created life from basically from nothing, or just like they did in the early Earth, when they actually haven't. And what is going on there? Why are they avoiding the very obvious conclusion that a Christian like Dr. James Tour would come to? Mm-hmm. And other sort of cultural things. How did we get to the point that we're here with that we're at with all the identity conversations? How did we get to the point where there are professing Christians who want to take the supernatural out of the Bible? They're going to be. How do we get to the point where we view the Gospel of John differently from the rest of the Gospels? The tie-in here is that there is a lot of cultural, intellectual stuff going on that is informing things in very strange ways, and we're going to try to uncover those for everyone and show them for what they are. So there's going to be a lot surrounding that.
Yeah, and I think one of the themes that we hinted at in several episodes before in season 2, when we've been sort of challenging some of the paradigms that scholars, or biblical scholars or others, have been sort of just repeating the party line, as it were, is the idea of how did we get to these, I won't say they're memes because they're not memes, but these tropes or these standard lines in scholarship, things like we already explained, for example, like we don't know who the authors of the New Testament are, or
right, yeah.
There's no good reason to believe that John is historical reportage. It's not synoptic. It's a special kind of thing outside of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or the Book of Acts. When reality is, it's just we're going to explore the idea of how we got there with one particular guest, Lydia McGrew. That'll be great, but also. How is it that we perpetuate these things without actually ever challenging them? So I'm looking forward to that, because we're going to get into the meat of just not just accepting things because people with lots of letters after their name say things. Now, we don't disregard those people, but we ought to delve into things and how to do that and think critically. But I am excited about this particular episode as well. I don't want to just talk about the future. I want to talk about the now as well.
Right.
Because we got plenty of guests. John Stonestreet will be joining us talking about cultural issues. Jim Wallace, and we got other guests who are going to be lining up to be a part of the podcast as well, so I'm very excited about. But I'm excited to talk about this particular topic. Again, another idea you had when we were sitting down in the chairs right behind me, when we were talking about what to speak about this season. And you had a really great idea a number of months ago, and it's coming to fruition now. So I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah. Yeah, I know sometimes, we've joked before that people will sometimes ask, man, what is it you guys talk about there all the time? You must be deep theology and cultural issues, just always. And it's like, yeah. And sometimes we talk about Dumb and Dumber too, but sorry, Dumb and Dumber, not Dumb and Dumber 2. That's a different movie, and we would never talk about that one. But the original Dumb and Dumber we do talk about. But this time we were actually talking about something, because we often will get and we'll talk about, like, man, I'm reading this book. You gotta hear this. Either this is wild, or this has been really helpful, because we're both, we're always reading, and that's a love language that should have been added to the book, but it wasn't.
That's ironic that books and reading should have been added to a book about love languages. But I love the double nesting and all that stuff. But
Yeah.
anyway, yeah.
So what we're going to do today is something a little different. Is we're just going to go through some of the things we've been reading recently, maybe some things we come back to a lot, and some things we're excited about. But essentially, consider this almost a summer reading list for you all if you're interested in what we read and what we find interesting. And one of the toughest things I know, as I was talking to Abdu before, was narrowing our lists down. Basically, we've got 5 books each, different categories to talk about them, and we'll talk about them a little bit. But obviously, we don't want to spoil the book for you because we really want you to go read it and experience it for yourself, and that's how you learn it best is by doing that. But yeah,
Oh, and by the
we don't
way,
know each other's books either.
we
I got
don't.
a sneak peek of some of yours, but you were still choosing from a list of what looked like 15 to 20 to get down to 5. So
Well, I went through these shelves and my stuff at home, and then I realized when I got here too, like, 'cause I wanted to hold up the books. I'll give a
yeah,
sneak peek. Here's one that I go back to all the time. In fact,
yeah,
there's a note on it to go back to it. That's one example. But I wanted to show a lot of the books, like literally on camera. And there's 2
hmm
books that I go back to all the time, but they're in my home library because they have a special place for me. Like some of my favorite books aren't even on the shelves here in the office because of
hmm
that reason. So we'll talk about those a little bit later. But yeah, I was trying to
yeah,
narrow down. Oh my goodness, I have shelves of books I could talk about.
hmm
I also want to say this though too. This is important. We have some books by friends we're going to be talking about, but the reality is this is not. No one knows we're doing this. None of the people who wrote these things, including and especially the ones who are already dead, know that we're doing this. This is not
yeah,
an endorsement show or a book review show. It's an equipping show. We want to bless you with understanding the books that we love and why we love them, and the books we're looking forward to loving in the future. So
yeah,
I get this question asked all the time, by the way. People keep on
yeah,
asking me for, could you recommend books? Could you recommend books? I know you get it tons. I get it
hmm
whether it's on the stage or it's after I speak. Can you give me a book list? I'm like, well, gosh, I can give you a library catalog of awesome books that we've been blessed with over the course of our lives, including books we don't always agree with, but
hmm
they sharpen our minds. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
yeah, absolutely. Well, why don't we go ahead and jump in with so the first category that I proposed to Abdu was what book should people just know about that maybe they don't. It's one that for some reason you kind of found it, but it seems to have flown under the radar a little bit, at least to my perception. Um, and yeah, so what type of a book would that be?
Hmm.
Um, and I will go first just to kind of make that like a I'll be the mid card and you'll be the main event for each of these. But so the first one I went with, this is a really cool, but it's a book I'd been looking for a long time, and I was just glad that eventually someone wrote it. It's called Of Popes and Unicorns, and Of Popes and Unicorns: Science, Christianity, and How the Conflict Thesis Fooled the World. So what the authors are talking about is there's always this conversation about, is there a conflict between religion and science, and specifically between Christianity and science. And a lot of times that is a scientific question. Sometimes it's a theological question or a biblical question or a philosophical question. But what they are addressing is the historical question, because there have been all of these claims about the conflict between religion and science for a very long time, going all the way back. And this is almost like, here's the proof that what Christians are trying to say now of like, oh, God has 2 books, which by the way, they've been saying for a very long time,
Yeah.
before modern science, well before, kind of led to modern science anyway.
Hmm.
But what, all of the stuff that they're saying Christians are kind of making up now, and that the real history is it's always been so just for example, if you've heard that Galileo was condemned for his scientific works and imprisoned by the Catholic Church, I think you'll be surprised by some of the stuff that you read in here. And for people who have been on the blog and have read some of the stuff we've done before, if you read I had a couple articles, one on called "The Curious Case of Nicholas Copernicus," and one called what was that other one? I write so many things. No, it was "Did Curiosity Kill the Christian?"
Right.
And basically, what's going on in those articles is it's pointing out something that is so ubiquitous. You think that ubiquitous in the culture. You think that Christianity has always been in conflict with science, and you know the stories. And those stories get told by very smart people, told and retold. Neil deGrasse Tyson on the Cosmos TV show popularized a lot of this again, especially for Galileo, for Giordano Bruno, and some other figures of this evil church attacking scientists for just studying the cosmos. Well, I'd say 99.9% of that is completely made up, and these David Hutchings and James Ungurianu have done us a really great service in showing who made it up, when they made it up, and what was made up, and what's real in all of those stories. And it's not a complete exoneration, by the way. Christians have done things in the past that have not been great, but you'll be surprised to find out how much Christians supported Galileo. And if you go to our website, you'll learn the same thing about Copernicus and how a lot of these men were actually guided by their faith and thought they were working on behalf of their faith. And actually, at the time, Copernicus, his main concern of the attacks against his work was that Aristotelians were not going to like it. And that was most of the attacks on people, even like Galileo, were Aristotelians. But he was afraid that people thought he was trying to make some point in I think like a ecclesiastical calendar debate. So he thought people were going to use his work as a theological point for an ecclesiastical calendar. It didn't seem to be on his radar that he would be overturning something about what we think about what the Bible says or God's place as related to ours or the earth or the universe altogether. So really great book.
Well, that's and that goes right back to that "how did we get here" thing. We have these views that this has always been the case, and we get these simplified views of something when we were in grade school, and it perpetuates, and people who ought to know better keep perpetuating it just because they can. Or because they believe it. I'm not saying they're being dishonest. I'm just saying they literally believe it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And along the lines of books that we think, how did we get to understand certain things the way we understand them? Or, even quote Bible verses the way we quote them or come to understand them in the West individually. In terms of a hyper-individualism, there's a great book that I think people don't know about or don't know enough about. And I don't agree with everything in this book. There's a couple of interpretations I think that they make in terms of different stories that see what they're getting at, and I think it's worthy of exploring, but I don't necessarily agree on this one particular interpretation of the David and Bathsheba story, for example. But Randolph Richards and Brandon O'Brien have a great book called Misreading Scripture Through Western Eyes. And the idea of this book is that oftentimes because mechanically the way that English is a language that is wonderful in many ways because it takes linguistic cues from other languages, whether it's Romance languages or non-Romance languages in the European continent, or even other languages that have nothing to do with the European continent, and puts them together to be very useful. It also suffers from the inability to understand when you're using the word "you," for example, like "you should do this," that oftentimes that word is plural, and it means you, all of you, collectively as a community should do this. And the reason why that's important, why they go into great lengths to talk about that and contexts about how Middle Easterners and Easterners think, is that the Bible is a Middle Eastern book where it was written to immediately in the context an Eastern and Middle Eastern audience. So if you don't understand the language that was being used to convey truth and ideas to those people, you'll misread it and misapply more maybe not only a modern standard, a 21st century standard to an ancient text, but you'll also understand it in terms of a hyper-individualistic culture when those cultures themselves were not individualistic. They didn't denigrate the idea of the individual, but they didn't elevate it to the level it is in our current societal structure. So a lot of the things that we often think as individual promises for ourselves or individual applicability of the Bible actually is more of a communal thing. And the reason why that's important for purposes of, embrace the truth in what we do is that oftentimes passages in the Bible or stories in the Bible can be misunderstood and even maybe mislabeled as, chronologically wrong or factually inaccurate or morally abhorrent. And what they do in this book, Misreading Scripture Through Western Eyes, is recover that sense of what did it mean at that time for those people, given the context in which they were reading it or hearing it in the first place. Now, the other thing that it does that I really like is that not only does it give us the ancient context so we can understand that those practices which we don't practice today actually applied then, is that you could also see the way the Bible is sort of countercultural given its cultural context. So, for example, the way Jesus talks to women and people of ethnic minorities and these kind of things actually is so countercultural to the prevailing way in which people talked back then, whether it was individualistic or collective in Eastern and Middle Eastern culture. Jesus broke the mold. And so what we see just from the pages of Scripture and just the understanding that sometimes it was collectivist, very Eastern, but other times it was, in fact, more of a Western modern view of the individual. So it has this sense in which it transcends, it's transtemporal. It's not just limited to the context in which it was written. It applies everywhere. So Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes by Richards and O'Brien is a book that I think a lot of folks, if they don't know about it, they ought to, because it'll give you a lot of insight into the beauty of the Scriptures themselves.
Yeah, and I think it's for me, studies like that were so important in making the Bible come alive, but also making me fall in love with it. Because you can have it preached to you in a very sort of flat 2D type of way. The context will help you. We're in a culture that, even if we, in many ways is moving away from its Christian past, in some ways it's also just sort of, infused with all of these Christian ideals that we take for granted now. So that when you, from this culture, look back at what Jesus is doing, you're like, okay, yeah, I agree. It's good that we take care of the poor. Yeah, it's good that we are concerned with suffering and we should be concerned about how victims are treated and those sorts of things. By understanding it in context, that's where that radical nature of what it is he was doing a lot will come out. And it's the radical nature of living, obediently to many things God has been saying the whole time, but that are hard to do. But it is that it's sort of breaking out of that and seeing, oh, there's a reason why we believe the things we do today. There's a reason why we even care at all about minorities and them having a voice, things that just would have gotten you laughed out of so many places in the ancient world.
Yeah.
Like, why should they have a voice? They're a minority for a reason. They're not successful. God didn't choose them, that sort of stuff. So it's interesting getting that contextual piece to then go back and read the Bible and seeing like, wow, Jesus, yeah, I can see why people were after him. Jews and Gentiles were after him and his followers.
Well, this actually reminds me, at the risk of violating the rule and going with one more book, because you've basically paraphrased a really important section from a book by David Bentley Hart called Atheist Delusions. And it responds in large respect to the God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. And, David Bentley Hart is obviously brilliant, pulls very few punches when it comes to the people he critiques.
And he critiques everyone.
He does. There's never been a person he doesn't like to critique.
Yeah.
But you got to hand it to him. He's got a lot of great stuff out there.
Yeah.
And in Atheist Delusions, a book that I think people don't know enough about, but should, what he does is he dismantles some of the common things that we think of in terms of critiques of Christianity. But and I'm going to summarize the quote that I often quote directly in some of my talks, where he basically says the same thing you just said, which was, when you look at our pagan pre-Christian ancestors, these ideas of equality and care for the indigent and the equal opportunity of all peoples and, taking care of the sick and injured amongst those who are not a part of your tribe. He says something along the lines of, he said, these ideas that we take for granted today would not have been laughable to our pre-Christian pagan ancestors. They wouldn't have known what you were talking about. They would have been unintelligible to them. Like, what are you talking about? And he goes back to this idea of the word person, which we often think of as being like a word that he's a person. You can't treat him like that. He's a person, as if that word person signifies dignity in and of itself. Yeah. Well, it didn't used to. It comes from a Latin word persona, which means mask, which is an artificial thing that was put on you by the state, in particular the Roman Empire, that you had to earn personhood. You didn't have personhood by virtue of birth. And what Hart is saying in Atheist Delusions is that idea of personhood that we take for granted was not something that was meant the same thing to our pagan pre-Christian ancestors. It was only the Christian message that once it spread within the realm of the Roman Empire and other empires as Christianity spread east, or other cultures, I should say, as Christianity spread east, was this idea of equality amongst people, regardless of station, race, or creed, was not intelligible to our pre-Christian ancestors, but became foundational to our Christian ancestors, and now we take it for granted. So another good book that people don't know enough about, but probably should, is David Bentley Hart's Atheist Delusions.
Yeah, yeah. Good point. I love me some David Bentley Hart. Mm-hmm. So the next one we were talking about is just what are you reading right now? And I think, I don't know, I might be cheating a little because technically I've already kind of read this book except for one chapter that I might get to one day. It's not as relevant to what I'm interested in, but so there's one I've not dug into. But this is kind of if you think, it's almost a part two to Carl Trueman's Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Mm-hmm. But it's not by Carl Trueman. It's by a guy named, you're going to be surprised by this, Abdu, because I've only mentioned this book to you about 1 million times. But Joseph, it's Minich or Minich. I'm not sure. I should have looked that up. But Bulwarks of Unbelief, Atheism and Divine Absence in a Secular Age. And this book is really fascinating because, we've learned a lot about how human beings operate. And, there are people like Ian McGilchrist who will talk about, left brain, right brain, where now we're being too controlled by the left brain and bad things happen when that starts happening. And that's not the only way to know truth and whatever. Mm-hmm. And what we know is, C.S. Lewis talked to us about this, and we can see it when we see smart people believing bad arguments, mm-hmm. is that we tend to think of ourselves as just highly rational people. And the imagination is this thing we use, or sometimes we give into, especially when we're young, but then we grow up and we get out of it. In reality, we're probably mostly imaginative, emotional people, and rational after that. That's even kind of the way that information comes into our brains, is first through the matrix of your emotions and imagination. And by imagination, I mean how you see the world, mm-hmm. and how you want to see the world, how you want to be seen in the world. And then you use your rational mind typically to justify those things. And this is why, in the early church, they would talk about, the passions, and the passions cloud you from being able to see clearly. And you need to, in many ways, when you're not in control of your passions, talking about your sin or the flesh or whatever, mm-hmm. you can't think clearly. And anyone who knows that, when you're going crazy on a sin binge or whatever, you can't think clearly. So there is this idea then that there's really something to overcome, but even something to embrace in that. And what Bulwarks of Unbelief talks about is this idea of, in a very interesting way, the idea of modern atheism. Most atheists will tell you, and we have often, swallowed the line ourselves, that this is an intellectual pursuit and they can't see. There's no good reasons. There's no good evidence for belief in God.
Mm-hmm.
And what Joseph Minnich is talking about is, he was not saying, okay, what are the arguments for and against and why can't they understand it? He was saying, why is it that today there is this overwhelming feeling, even many times among believers, that you can't feel God, that there is a divine absence. Previously, and centuries before, and especially before, say, the Industrial Revolution, which is connected but isn't the whole story, people would say, maybe you always felt God was around. There was no denying he was real. I mean, look, how can you deny this? But maybe you'd be questioning his goodness, or are you being punished for something, or whatever. There was that sort of a thing because bad stuff happened, and the way you dealt with bad stuff was, why, God, why? And at some point it switched to, when bad stuff happens, not why, God, why, but is God even real? And it's hard. I can't feel him. It seems like the world is just out to get us at every step. So it's this switch happened. And again, I don't want to go into the whole thing because I would love for people to explore this for themselves, but it was just fascinating because he's really talking about how certain things act on the subconscious, such as what we do for our jobs, what we do in our lives. But like for a lot of people, you can't separate who you are from what you do.
Yeah.
And then when you move into a certain type of job where you're no longer serving your family or your community, but you're serving faceless entities, you're not treated as a valued member. You're a cog in the machine. You start to think almost like, and you're also being told at the same time that the universe is kind of like a machine, and you start to think very machine-like. You start to think things are meaningless. And he talks about the rise of atheism in the working class first. Some philosophers thought it, but it really got popular in the working class, and then their children, who they were able to provide a better life for and go to school. Then it got into the educated class, and on it went. And so it's just this fascinating seeing him trace out the argument and back it up with data, back it up with a lot of really interesting evidence on, okay, so he said, okay, so this is the hard part now for an atheist to wrestle with, is you think you're making a purely rational choice, that you don't believe because of this, that, and the other, when really you may not be able to open yourself up to certain types of evidence. You've blocked it off because that's just not how you're choosing to see the world because of these other things. So even take the argument of, well, you're only a Christian because you were raised in a Christian country with Christian parents, and but if you were raised in a Hindu country, then you'd be Hindu. You could say the same exact thing to the atheist. And this book does a great job of giving you some data to go behind that. It's not just an interesting logical, I'm going to flip it on you and say the same thing now that you're in a post-Christian society, that you could say that too.
Yeah. No,
this is actually what's going on, and it makes sense. Even he gives this example. I'll give you one quick example of, there is a difference between when you're in a society and you go to a village, and in the center of town, the tallest building is a church, soars above other things. Everyone meets there. It's the place where community happens. Versus now, you go into a city, and the church is dwarfed by the PNC building, and we're in a very greed-soaked society. And it's all fine. So the way that these little things kind of get into your subconscious, and you think a lot of our thoughts aren't our own, and I think for too long, some more modernist-leaning people like the Richard Dawkins of the world and people who like him have been living the unexamined life. And I hope this book will get into their hands actually and make them kind of rethink some of what they've been doing and thinking.
See, that's so funny because that to me is right in step with some stuff I've been reading lately. Part of that is because of the research I've been doing in order to prepare for the forthcoming book that I'm working on that you're helping me with, which is provisionally entitled Reality Collapse. And what I'm looking at is the two cultural tsunamis that have resulted from the seaquake of the post-truth mindset. And post-truth mindset basically is the mindset that says that feelings and preferences matter more than facts and truth. We don't ignore facts and truth altogether. We just use them conveniently when it comes up with when it comports with our feelings and our preferences. And the two tsunamis that have resulted from the seaquake of that are the sort of breathless anticipation and use of AI without regard to some of the downsides to it and what it will do to us and what we'll do with it. And my main concern is what we'll do with it, but also the identity crisis we're experiencing now, whether it's identity crises that have to do with gender ideologies or just not even knowing who the heck we are, and why the culture is so anxious now. And I don't mean anxious like worried. I mean like riddled with actual clinical anxiety.
Yeah.
Especially people who are at a younger age having the highest levels of anxiety in a long time. And we can explain why that might be in different ways. But to that end, the reason why I say this, because the books that I'm reading right now on the cultural level have to do with some of the gender ideology stuff. But what I wanted to bring up were a few books that sort of take the other end of the spectrum of the we're just machines that Joseph Minich would say is part of a bulwark of unbelief, which I think is actually right. That's on one end of the spectrum of what we're being told repeatedly, especially our young people. But then on the top end of the spectrum is, because the spectrum is not this way. I think when we're being told it's this way. We're being told at base that we're meat computers, to quote one atheist, or we are the gods of our own skull-sized universes, to paraphrase David Foster Wallace in his sort of assessment of where we are. And so in the middle of all of that back and forth between these two impossible to reconcile claims that we're told we have to believe both of, the mind doesn't work well in trying to reconcile those two impossibly contradictory claims. And so anxiety results. And so I think one of the bulwarks of the new belief system of the self and all these things becomes the deification of the self while also debasing the self as a machine. So I'm reading Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. And while I'm not through it, it is something I am reading and going through. And Jonathan Haidt, of course, with the coddling of the American mind and the canceling. He didn't write it, but he did the foreword for the canceling of the American mind. And he's written a lot of really great, I think, cultural assessment books. Yeah. And this one I'm really eager to dive into even further because I think he does unpack a lot of the reasons why we're so anxious. And it's coming from a non-Christian perspective. It's not coming from an anti-Christian perspective. It's just coming from a sort of secular view of things. And I think it can inform us all, whether we're Christians or not Christians, about why we are the way we are in terms of our cultural anxieties. But stemming from bulwarks of unbelief is also this, because there's no such thing as non-belief. I think, again, David Foster Wallace was really great on this when he said that there are no such things as atheists in a real sense, because everyone worships something. And he said that at his commencement address to Kenyon College before he passed away. He had said that we all worship something, and a lot of what we worship is not transcendent. But we're looking for meaning. We're looking for this sense of transcendence. And so Tara Burton has written, again, not from a Christian perspective, but I think an insightful perspective, 2 books that I'm reading right now. One's called Strange Rites, R-I-T-E-S, Strange Rites, New Religions in a Godless World. And she talks about essentially how we're inventing these religious experiences through fandom, fan fiction and fandom, through these semi-pseudo-mystical experiences at various clubs or plays we go to. Think of the way people had almost this weird, I wouldn't even say sycophantic, but odd obsession with Hamilton, for example. Even my tribe of Star Wars nerds have all this like there's actually a religious order, a religious movement called Jediism, mostly out of Australia, a very small group of people, but they go by the code of the Jedi. So she talks about how we got here. Where did we get all this sort of new, like, pastiche of different religious traditions that conform now to our personal preferences, and we have a buffet view of religion. And so I think that's an interesting juxtaposition, which from bulwarks of unbelief to this idea of belief, but not in traditional religion or even things that would be God in a classically monotheistic sense, but something that is spiritual nonetheless. So that's one book, Strange Rites. And then she has another book that is related to it. And I think, and I'm just diving into this one, it's called Self-Made, where she also talks about this idea of the self-deification. So those are 3 books that I'm reading right now. I know that you have a stack. I walk by your office all the time, and I see the stack, and the stack grows. Like many people who are probably watching or listening, there's some frustration with being an avid lover of books that the I'm getting to it kind of thing can be awfully tough. I do have a tip, by the way. I get asked this all the time. What's a tip for how to get through the amount of information or the books that we love so much? And I think this is going to be a total aside, guys. I think a way to do this is to compartmentalize and prioritize the things you want to get through. Some things you read purely for the enjoyment of it, and take your time. Really enjoy the meal of that book. But there are some books you need to read because you need to know the information. And then there are other books that you need to really absorb the information, not because the book is so enticing that you can't put it down, but you need to know it for your work or for your life or your interactions with others. So what I do is I prioritize these things. This is not, I'm not shilling for Amazon or for Audible or anything like that right now, but I will say one of the things that I do is I love the feel of an actual book and reading through an actual book. There's nothing like it. Studies show that you tend to retain the information more when you actually put your hands on something and then you flip through an actual page and highlight with an actual highlighter.
I think that's true. Yeah.
So don't forsake that. But for the sake of room, I put things on an e-reader. But Amazon has the ability to take a book and get it on Kindle and then also get the audio book, and they sync up. So there are times when, whispers, So I had to do that sometimes. And what I've done is also cultivate the art of listening at high speed. So there are times when I have to listen to an audio book, for example. I just have to know what the book is arguing. And I put it at double, sometimes triple speed, depending on how technical it actually is, and absorb it. And sometimes I'll slow it down, or I'll actually go and say, I need to read that book now. So I can prioritize that way. But there's so many great books out there that I'm still in the frustration of, boy, I want to actually read the real thing. I love the stack. I love the feel of pulling one off the stack and reading it. And that whole feeling of ending a book, like there's a tragedy to it, but also a sense of triumph. Because there's something about like closing something that's thick in your hands and saying, I read that thing and I got so much out of it. But anyway, that's an aside, but it's still, I think, something that people can benefit from is how to prioritize these things.
Well, let me give, so since we've talked, a couple of tips it's just for my own, because I've gone through, I've created like sort of self-syllabi over, like here are the books you're going to be reading at this point. Here's, on Monday you read this type of book, on Tuesday you read this. And it does get hard to keep track of some of the information sometimes. So I typically will have like, here's a book I'm specifically reading for work. Here's a book I'm reading for personal. A lot of times there's overlap. Sometimes there's not. But as much as you can, if you're like me, someone with a lot of stacks, and sometimes depending on, like with this type of a work that we do, you've got to be in a lot of different books at one time. Mm-hmm. But as much as you can, try to read one book at a time, because you're always frustrated. They're always frustrated that, I can't finish. I've got all these books I want to finish. If you stuck to one. Realize you don't have to read it word for word either, depending on, like you said, what type of a book is it? How much do you need the exact information? Do you need every chapter, or do you just need these chapters? And, trying to figure that out. But let your excitement for getting to the next book urge you on to read the one book quickly and get through it and prioritize the reading, because sometimes it's just, you can waste so much time sitting there agonizing over which one you should be reading, starting one and saying, no, okay, I'm going to put that away, I'm going to do this one. And so at the end of a week, you've read 50 pages, but it's one page from 50 different books. Mm-hmm. So you've essentially made no progress. And so that's just from my own sort of anxious reading patterns, and what I found has helped me sort of do that. But let's go on. I'll go through these last ones kind of quicker. I know this is going to be a long one, but
I thought it would be short, but you know what? I kind of suspected we'd have gone on for a while. I hope that the people who are listening, which you can do at triple speed apparently, will be benefited by it.
Well, I think, if it's me, people are talking about like books that I may not have heard of, I'm there for the whole thing. So, what book would you come back to again and again? Now, here's an issue where I'm going to cheat again just a little, because I wish I had brought a book, because there's one book I go back to so much that it's at home, because I always want to kind of have it if I need it. It's not technically one that I'd necessarily have to have here for research purposes, but that book is by Athanasius of Alexandria, called On the Incarnation. And if you get the SVS Press version, there's a great opening essay by C.S. Lewis on it. But this is one of these Trinitarian defenders from the early centuries of the church. Now, there's another really great book that talks about Irenaeus a lot and incarnation, and Abdu and I both like this book. It's called Incarnational Humanism by Jens Zimmerman. It's Incarnational Humanism, a Philosophy of Culture for the Church in the World. And there are just a lot of things I like about it. One, it connects a lot of things about what did the incarnation mean to, again, the first Christians, and then what threads of that survived through the centuries, through different changes in culture, even up into Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Henri de Lubac, and sort of these figures that I got into way before, in some ways, the actual early Christians. I mean, I'm a Dietrich Bonhoeffer nut, so and a lot of people know what he did in his life. They don't know that he actually had really beautiful theology, incarnation-heavy theology that inspired the things he did in his life. And that's kind of another one of the points, is that, theology is never sort of just meant to be theology. It's meant to tell you something about how you should be living, who God is, and how you should be living. As a matter of fact, the hymn of Philippians 2, where it's, he took on the form of a servant, and he emptied himself and all that. Paul prefaces that by saying, here's how you should act towards one another. So it's almost like you get this beautiful theological statement almost incidentally, because he's trying to describe to you how to live as a Christian. So one of the things I love about this book too is just, as a lot of people listening to us are probably Christians who are very interested in how to share their faith with others. And there is this almost a stereotype of evangelism that we've come to believe. Sometimes people are afraid of, we were just talking about this yesterday, Abdu. Sometimes people are afraid of evangelism because they have certain ideas about what it means to evangelize.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we think it means is you have to convince someone that they're the worst sinner in the world, and then tell them, I've got good news because there's someone who's going to forgive you. Now, you might find, and maybe you've had this issue before, that at maybe it's not the best time in someone's life to bring it up. Are they interested in God because their mother just passed away and they're devastated?
Right.
Okay, there might be another method for you to go through to it. So what I like about this is that it talks a lot about a very broad, wide, and old Christian tradition, all the way back to the beginning, of not just what the incarnation meant, what it meant for anthropology, the Christian anthropology, and that sort of thing. and it shows you the dual nature, the chimera of mankind, the dual nature of, yes, we're sinners, but also we're made in the image of God. And so there are other ways to get into let's say, an evangelistic encounter other than just saying you're a sinner in need of salvation. You can say, you can talk about how they're wayward, or how, it's great that you love justice. Do you want to know where that comes from?
Right.
You can actually do it through complimenting them. Like, wow, you're really concerned about justice. That's awesome. The reason is, and you can go about this a number of different ways, but you're created in the image of someone who was very interested in justice in the way that people treated his creation. So, so for those reasons and for many others, I just think this was a really eye-opening book for me, because it showed a different sort of, not the simplistic, like you're just a worm, and I need to convince you that you're this sinful, disgusting beast of a person, and you've met people who aren't Christians who don't fit that bill, and you wonder how to speak to them about Jesus and why they still need him and what he means for their life. That's a good place to start. It does get in the middle very sort of philosophical and stuff like that, but stick with it. That's all really helpful too. But the bookends, I think, for me, were the most valuable aspect of that book.
Yeah, that's a valuable insight to look into, the way that works in terms of practical ways in which things stand out, and like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that would apply in this particular way. That's really great. Some of my go-tos, gosh, I have so many go-tos. I'll go more the devotional route. One's more theological and is rigorous in its theology, but I really do believe every Christian should know about this book, and I return to it all the time for theological reasons, but also inspirational reasons, is John Stott's The Cross of Christ, which is, of course, a classic. I think I've referred to that book either by citing it or by just thinking it through and getting my ideas refreshed in my mind on some things in every book I've ever written. I've gone back to it in some form or fashion for my work reasons, and for the work of trying to convey the gospel credibly, but also for my own devotional reasons. So John Stott's The Cross of Christ, he really goes into a lot of the theology about why the cross, how Christians have thought about it over the course of the centuries, and understanding penal substitution without necessarily making it boring and dry. There's a real sense of reverence in everything John Stott says, but the reverence isn't so thick that it replaces the rigor with which he thinks about the logic of the cross itself. And not just the logic, but also the beauty from how it speaks to our human condition. One of the things I've often said, and I get this from Stott, is that the cross is essentially a compliment God pays to us by telling us that our actions actually matter. And not only they matter temporally in this world, but they echo into eternity. That's why the cross has to happen, and why Jesus never loses his scars. I think that is tremendous. In fact, it's funny. I think about it so often because we have a couple of viral videos right now on our socials, some reels on our Instagram and other places where I'm talking about the sacrifice that Jesus made, and the greatest possible being, who is God, expressing the greatest possible ethic, which is love, in the greatest possible way, which is self-sacrifice. Well, one of the comments that was made is that self-sacrifice, did Jesus really do that? I mean, he was gone for the weekend. And this is sort of a paraphrase of something that Michael Shermer had chided Christians about, is that Jesus didn't die for your sins. He just gave up his weekend for your sins. And you and I have done a whole episode talking about, or at least part of an episode, responding to that. And what Stott does beautifully is talk about the qualitative nature, even though there's a temporal nature to the sacrifice in the sense of death on Friday, resurrection on Sunday. There is still something qualitatively eternal in that sense, in what Jesus paid in terms of that sorrow on the cross. It wasn't just, I was dead for 3 days. There was something else, was why he says, my God, why did you forsake me? And the fact that he bears his scars forever. John Stott goes into a lot of that kind of a thing. So I highly recommend this. If you ever want to understand the depth and beauty of the cross of Christ, I would highly recommend reading The Cross of Christ. But for devotional purposes, I often go back to as well is stuff by Tozer, specifically The Pursuit of God and Knowledge of the Holy. I think these are great books that are. Tozer has a way of writing beautifully on the theology, but in a way that's self-reflective enough of himself and gets the reader to reflect, sometimes in an uncomfortable way. And I think the best books are the books that leave you feeling uncomfortable about where you sit with something or stand with something. And Tozer has a way of making you be uncomfortable with where you sit with yourself and your relationship to God. And of course, the books that I would hold up that I have. Now, those books I have, by the way, in my office at home. But the books that I have multiple copies of, so I can bring them in my office, is C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. Let me back up and so you can on the focus here. Mere Christianity. I mean, I don't know how many times I've referenced this book, so I read this book quite often. And then Chesterton's. I love Chesterton because Chesterton is sharp and quick, and some of the best lawyers that I got trained by were sharp and quick, like Chesterton types. So G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy, amongst many other books that he's written, is a tremendous book that I go back to. And in fact, this one's falling apart. I've gone back to it so many times.
Yeah, by the way, for each of these categories, I thought we were doing one book apiece, but since
we were. I cheated. I totally.
doing this multiple. I'm just going to mention C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man. Going to get that in there because it just barely didn't make the cut. And then Nicholas Walter Storff's Lament for a Son.
Great book.
Is like such a, especially for someone who's gone through loss. I think I've talked about it on the show before. When I was young, my brother was 18 and he passed away in a car accident. And many, many, many years later, I read this book and I told my mom about it, and she read it and she said, and she's not one to like read like theological type stuff, and he does get a little theological. I wouldn't even say I agree with it 100% everything he says, but I think he gets more right than not. And but anyway, she said, "Wow, it's like he was actually there, like the way he talked about it." So that's great because it's a short book, and for sometimes it's hard to know how to talk to people who've gone through that if you haven't experienced it. Especially the more we know now about the things like, God just needed another angel or something like that doesn't help anyone at all.
Yeah.
And that's not even how that works. So, there's just those sorts of things. So it's a really good book for that, but also just for you to read and go through yourself. Such a beautiful book. Now, the next category that we were going to talk about is going to be a doozy. This is, what book would you recommend from someone who disagrees with you? Well, hey, friends, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. If you want to get more content like this and help support the ministry, a very easy way to do that is just to subscribe to us. Click the bell so you get notifications. Like the video, comment, take part in the conversation. And for those of you just listening to this and not seeing our beautiful faces live, you can just follow the podcast and rate it. That will help us get the word out. We thank you so much for taking your time to do that. God bless. Yeah, so the book that I chose for, and there are so many good ones. Obviously, just want to say real quick, anything Christopher Hitchens is very interesting, at least because he's a good writer. He's almost the David Bentley Hart of atheism, in the sense that he has a wit and a way to cut through stuff that can be really helpful. But the one I chose is by a philosopher at Duke, named Alex Rosenberg, called "The Atheist's Guide to Reality: Enjoying Life Without Illusions." And I have a lot of respect for Alex Rosenberg because a lot of times when Christians talk, you can straw man other people's beliefs, but a lot of times we say, well, as an atheist, you should believe this. If naturalism is your philosophical, worldview, it's how you view all of reality, and even maybe materialism, although not all of them are materialists. I find that difficult, but some will say they're not materialists. And anyway, we'll often say this is what you should be believing, and this happens a lot when you talk to someone about, let's say, the problem of evil, or sorry, not just the problem of evil, but the moral law, and is there good and is there evil, because they want to say there is, and that people still have value, and you don't need God for that. So people like Matt Dillahunty and Sam Harris will still try to make this case, which we've also, Abdu, you've talked about that in podcasts. I've got a couple articles on morality up on the website that specifically dive into that sort of utilitarian way they talk about things. Well, I don't think they'd call it that, but it's essentially that. It's like a pragmatic kind of utilitarian thing.
It's like sort of a pragmatism, utilitarianism, consequentialism kind of a thing.
Yeah. And so, yeah, exactly. Consequentialism is a big one there too. And so what Alex Rosenberg does is really interesting, because he is unafraid to face the consequences of what it means to really take God out of the equation. And so what I like about the book, while I disagree with 100% of it, I would imagine, I mean, I agree that if that's what you think about God, then this is what you should believe about reality. That's why, when I was an atheist, in many ways I was a very sad atheist, because I accepted the conclusions of it. And there are many reasons to be sad if this is your worldview, but I respect him for being very consistent and he'll call out other people who are fellow atheists, or at least non-believers in some sense, even if they don't have it all figured out. And he'll just say, like, you can't say that. You can't say that a human being has some intrinsic value. Like, you have to really live out the ramifications of being only an accidental collection of atoms that has learned to make sounds that we provide meaning to, or whatever. So I quote him a lot in the morality articles, because he'll go to task with people like Dawkins, Richard Dawkins originally was sort of like, yeah, there's not really a good or bad. We dance to our own DNA, that sort of thing. But he got somewhat influenced by Sam Harris's work, and Alex Rosenberg kind of just basically says things like, so you're telling me that, we just so happened to get it right, random, and he's saying that this is too much of a coincidence. This is clearly just a way that we have evolved to make ourselves feel better in the situation we're in, but we have to know it's an illusion, and as a biologist you should know that. So so I love the just the clearness, and if you've ever had one of those situations where you think, man, am I missing something? Am I crazy for thinking they should think that? Maybe they don't need to. No. And Alex Rosenberg is your guy that you can go to and say, okay, there you go. And sometimes people also point out Peter Singer does the same thing, but he says so many things that are just harmful for your soul to hear that I don't think you need to really go down that route.
Yeah. He sort of reminds me, Rosenberg reminds me of Julian Baggini, who wrote a short piece called Life Without God is Bleak. Atheism is about owning up to that, where he talks about the idea that there really are no second chances. And then he takes to task that billboard that was up some years ago that was on the sides of buses, double-deckers in London and other places, the one that the British Humanist Association had sponsored. There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. And Baggini says, can you really tell that to someone who's lost a child to suicide after years of depression? There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. He's like, that's wishful thinking, which is ironic, of course. I'm going to ask you a question because that book and your discussion of it sort of leads to something. We had, again, one of our posts had some comments to it. I have a post on Instagram. It's a reel where I talk about the idea that Jesus doesn't tell you what you want to hear. He tells you what you need to hear. And all other beliefs, even the atheistic beliefs, might teach that people, if they do enough good things and spread the wealth enough and do all this stuff, will have a Star Trek-like existence in a utopia. In other words, we can be the solution to our own problems. And I got a lot of comments on that, was that atheism doesn't actually teach anything. Atheism is just a lack of belief in God. And I think Rosenberg and Baggini might actually, at least not say, then at least imply that that's a bit of a cop-out, because
Yeah.
if you think there is no ultimate meaning to the universe, that itself is a worldview. It's
Yeah.
not quite nihilism, but it is an understanding that ideas like morality and these things don't exist. So you don't lack belief in morality. You recognize there is no such thing. If there's no evidence for a God, then that trickles down into how you view the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does. So as a worldview, it does teach something. It does provide you with a worldview.
Yeah.
Do you think Rosenberg would agree with that statement?
I think he would, because because his whole thing is just there are intellectual ramifications for these decisions. Now, he may not, he tends to kind of focus more on the scientific. And if you believe these things about science, this is the thing. And of course, his science leads him to doubt. Although we just talked about the bulwarks of unbelief, so we know what's really leading him to doubt. But the science thing leads him to sort of doubt all of that. So he wouldn't, I think he would agree with you, though, that's a bit of a cop out just to say, and it's a meaningless statement anyway. I mean, atheism doesn't teach any. Okay, but so what do you want to call it? Philosophical naturalism?
Right.
You want to call it materialism? You want to?
Yeah.
It's the belief that this one thing is all there is. So just whatever would make you happy, change it from atheism to that, and then tell me what's wrong with the statement that I made, or something like that. It's just
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's
a juke.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And from my fighting days, I know what that's like, and I know how to get out of something.
Yeah.
Give them the slip as it were.
I forgot you used to be a henchman. I always forget that.
Yes, I henched so many times. For the record, I was never a henchman. You got to be careful with these things. You got to make sure we clarify these things. I was never a henchman. I did do full contact mixed martial arts fighting for quite some time, so that's a little different. And I didn't do it for anyone except for myself.
Okay.
So just make sure we're clear. I'm a very large guy, and people might think that's someone's henchman, but I was never a henchman.
Thou dost protest too much.
Oh boy.
All right. What was your selection?
Moving along. So on the science, and people I don't agree with, but a book that I highly recommend, that I've recommended from the platform many times, is a book called Aping Mankind, by a neurologist and an evolutionary biologist, or at least an evolutionary thinker, Raymond Tallis. So Aping Mankind. And he talks about two phenomena that he thinks we're trying to understand how it is that human beings have consciousness and morality and these kinds of things from a naturalistic standpoint. And he says we've bet on two different philosophies that he chidingly calls neuromania and Darwinitis. Neuromania is the idea that you can explain everything, including consciousness and morality, through neuroscience. And he says this fascination with it is like a mania. And he is a neurologist, and he's someone who believes in neuroscience. He just doesn't think that neuroscience actually explains human consciousness. And he says the other competing naturalistic framework is Darwinism, or he calls it Darwinitis, sort of the ad hoc way in which we explain everything through Darwinism in almost a tautological sense. And one of his arguments is that you really can't, if Darwinism explains everything, it doesn't actually explain anything. And one of my favorite lines in the book is that if Darwin were the last word on human rationality, there would be no human rationality to explain it. And he thinks Darwinism and Darwinian evolution, especially the neo-Darwinian ideas, are the cat's whiskers. He thinks it's the stuff, man. It's the way it really happened. Yeah. But he doesn't believe that it explains everything. And so from an atheist standpoint, and he has to spend some time defending that he's an atheist, which is really interesting because he's often charged with being like a secret closet theist, and he's not. And well, I read this book some years ago, so I don't know if he's become one since then. And he was a fairly old guy, I believe, when he wrote that one, so I don't know what the situation is now. But Aping Mankind is a great book for debunking the idea that the current top two naturalistic means for explaining human consciousness, neuroscience, and Darwinism don't do the job and can't even do the job, even in principle, let alone based on the current state of evidence. I like it for a number of reasons. One, he's incredibly honest with the data. Two, he does not pull punches at religion. He doesn't think much of it, which means there's no believer bias involved in this. But also, he's really funny. Like, I like the way he writes. He writes humorously, and he doesn't write so technically that you get lost in the technical details. He does get technical, but he writes in a way that the technical isn't so boring as to be mind-numbing. He writes about it and moves along, and I think he's fair with it. So if you want to read a engaging, honest, and at times quite humorous book about this issue from someone who doesn't agree, if you're a Christian, and if you're an atheist and you want to read someone who is on your side but says, hey, look, we got some work to do and some serious problems to overcome, I highly recommend Raymond Tallis's Aping Mankind.
Yeah, that's I've not read that, but now I want to. Seeing that's exactly how this podcast is meant to work.
Yeah, exactly.
It's working within this, and let's see here. Well, why don't we transition? Oh, by the way, anything Albert Camus. And why don't we transition? There's a guy who again, he's at least sad about the ramifications of his belief, but we must imagine Sisyphus happy nonetheless.
We have to.
But so let's start to wrap this up then. And basically, this last one is just, what book are you looking forward to when it comes out? And this will be a quick one because we haven't read it yet. It hasn't come out, so we don't have much to say about it. But there are some books coming out. The one I'm going to mention is coming out in August. It would be a great sort of summer read for the nerds out there. And it's by a guy named Brant Petrie, who's he's a Catholic scholar, but has written so many helpful books. For anyone who watched our episode on the authorship of the Gospels, his book, The Case for Jesus, the Biblical and Historical Evidence for Christ, was something that was a great resource. And he does a great job of compiling a lot of data that's been kind of floating around in various books into one source. So that was really helpful. But he's got a book coming out in August called Jesus and Divine Christology. And so I just wrote an article not too long ago on some of the evidence for if Jesus is God. And obviously this is one of the major things that Bart Ehrman likes to attack a lot through the scriptures. And there are all these, like we've talked about before, there are all these bizarre ideas sometimes about this late Christology that developed. You can't trust John because he's too late. The synoptics do this and this one does that, and Paul you can't trust because maybe he didn't write that one because there's a different word in there than is in these other letters, all this weird stuff. And someone like Brant Petrie, I know, is going to cut through a lot of that, give you and just read it with an open mind. Even if you don't agree with the type of thing that I'm saying here, read him and compare the evidence. And I can, even without having read it, I can pretty much guarantee you that you'll be left with a very robust examination of this by Brant Petrie that you will find lacking in other sources that attempt to attack and discredit a lot of the Bible. He will question a lot of those assumptions and then show a lot of data. I have a lot of confidence in him because he's been just so helpful in the future. So I'm really excited that he is now tackling this issue. And so when he does, I'll update my top books on divine Christology, and I'll add his book in there after I read it, I'm sure. But yeah, that's when I would really tell people to kind of be on the lookout. And looks like it'll be $40, but one day it'll come in paperback. So if you can't get it right away.
Well, along those lines on the divine Christology, a book that I know we're both anticipating and looking forward to. There's already an edition out of it called Putting Jesus in His Place by Ed Kamaszewski and Robert Bowman. We had Rob on the show, and we're going to have both of them, Ed and Rob, on the show. They are good friends and great scholars as well. they've updated, and not just updated, like they didn't add a couple of pages to their previous book. They've really updated this book to be rigorous, scholarly, and it's a defense of the a high Christology of Jesus and the divinity of Jesus. And the new book coming out in December, and it is a little more on the pricier side as far as I can tell. It's going to be in the 50s, but it's definitely something worth getting if this is a topic you're interested in delving into as a skeptic, or if you're interested in defending it as a Christian. And I think it's definitely worth defending. The book is called The Incarnate Christ and His Critics, A Biblical Defense, again by Robert Bowman and Ed Komashevsky, with a foreword by Michael Bird. I think it's going to be a terrific book. If the first version of it, Putting Jesus in His Place, is any indication of the quality of what's going to come out with The Incarnate Christ and His Critics, you're in for a real treat because they do a great job. They make things memorable, and they don't shy away from counter-argument as well. So The Incarnate Christ and His Critics, coming out in December. I wish it was earlier, but I'm really looking forward to the fact that both of them have agreed, and I've now basically made them have to come on the show by doing it on the record now. They both agreed to come on the show, so I'm looking forward to having our friends Ed and Rob on the show to discuss their book. Yeah,
that'll be great. By the way, I know some of these books are expensive for some people. I did just see an episode of The Simpsons where Bart and Milhouse and Martin wanted a comic book, and they just pooled their money together. So if you have a couple friends who are also interested in these things, you can read it together and share it. And just don't don't do what they did. It turned into a very Lord of the Flies situation on The Simpsons. But
and what we do is we go for highbrow here. We went to all these books. Yeah. We ended highbrow. The Simpsons is definitely a culturally highbrow moment. Well, we started with Dumb and Dumber, so we bookended this with our true natures. So people really know what goes on in this office now.
That is sadly the truth. So I wanted to say real quick too, for some of the episodes, you're going to see us like this. We are transitioning. We're actually in the same. Abdu's mere feet from me, right over there. We're getting our new studio put together, so we are going to be in the same room again. So it's going to look a little different, but also we're not shying away from just being as in depth as we need to be and having longer episodes. Most people are listening to this on commutes and stuff like that, so we really want to. And that was something that we've noticed. People really kind of like going in depth, however long it takes. And so this episode was a little longer than some of ours have been, but I hope you found it valuable. And Abdu, we normally end with you having some closing arguments. I don't know that you'll have a closing argument here, but would you like to instruct the jury in some? Yeah, that's not a lawyer. I think doesn't the judge do that? I don't know.
The judge instructs the jury, but I'll just say this for now is my encouragement to the jury is be a reader of great books. I think you'll benefit from the list of things which will be in the description. Whether it's the show notes or the description, the books that we've mentioned here will be there with their links. And there's so many more we could have said. By the way, comment. We'd love to hear from you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Tell us books that you find indispensable, books that you're looking forward to. Comment as well. We'd love to hear from you. And maybe if we haven't read the book already, we'd love to read that book and maybe make a comment or two on it ourselves. Yeah. So be a good reader of these books, ladies and gentlemen, and you'll notice the smattering of books. Don't forget this, though. If I was going to say one more thing. Don't just read a bunch of heavy nonfiction books. Be a reader of fiction, but also be a reader of devotion books. Be a reader of artistic books. Read poetry. Read hymns. And I think you'll enrich your life so much better by having a well-rounded view or a well-rounded library at your disposal. And if you are like me and you have the stack you need to get to, we'll get to it already, and I'll get to it too. So until the next time, friends, thanks, Derek, for this. Thanks, Zach, for producing it. And until then, the defense rests.